So in terms of, I mentioned earlier on that the demographics in the UK has changed
Yes.
significantly over the past 30 years or so. And the issues that are brought with that are, there are some issues that are very, in terms of under the broad umbrella of child abuse and neglect, are very different in terms of...
Welcome to Care Vision's Professional Talk, the discussion show that brings you vital insights from leading voices in social care, education, health, and youth development. I'm Humphrey Hawksley, and I speak to trailblazers, researchers, and practitioners. And for all of those interested in how we care within our society, come join us. Whether you're a practitioner, educator, family member, or curious learner, join us to think, reflect, and grow new ideas. Hello and welcome. I'm Humphrey Hawksley. This is Care Vision's Professional Talk, where we discuss issues on health and social care that are critical to all our lives. The professional bit refers to specialisms and peer groups. The talk part is a prompt about how we communicate with each other, professionals talking between themselves, and to civilians like myself in a language that we hope we all understand. My guest is the Professor of Social Work at Goldsmiths College in London, and as a qualified social worker, she has had frontline experience with children and troubled families and the system that envelops them. Welcome, Claudia Bernard, to Care Vision Professional Talk.
Thank you very much for that really warm welcome.
It's great, really great to have you here, Claudia. I just want to take you up on one thing to begin with, which we can return to. But what do you see now, with all your experiences, the biggest challenge facing the foster and childcare home system in Britain today?
I think one major challenge is that there aren't that many. I'm thinking of when I started to work as a social worker in the late 80s, early 90s. There were lots of options. There were lots of residential homes, foster carers, etc. And there were less children coming into the care system. Now there is very few residential homes, and there are disproportionate numbers of children coming into the care system, and there are less foster carers to meet children's needs. And I think a key factor in that is that particularly older children, adolescents, and some groups of children come into the system much older, early adolescent teenagers, and they have very, very complex needs that there aren't in the foster carers sufficient numbers who are able or willing to actually work with those groups of children. So I think that's a major factor.
That gives us some, so less residential homes, more children coming in, and less foster carers. You mentioned when you started back in the 80s. How did you get into this profession? Was it a calling? Did you stumble into it? Did something happen in your life that said, this is what I need to do?
I didn't exactly stumble, but when I left school, I was working in the city doing administrative work, and it didn't take me long to realize that wasn't really fulfilling for me, and I wasn't going to get very far. And so I started to volunteer. And I volunteered for a project that worked with young people to actually disadvantage and marginalize young people to help them get into the employment.
How old were you then?
Sorry?
Yeah, how old were you at that stage?
I was old enough.
Not a teenager in your 20s?
No. You shouldn't ask a lady her age.
I know, no, not now, but then, sort of, just to get an idea of. Anyways, you can carry on.
I was kind of in my 20s.
Okay.
I started to volunteer with young people, and I really got a lot from that, and that sort of sparked something for me. And then later on, I started to get involved in projects that worked with domestic violence victims, rape victims, gender-based violence. I started to volunteer and work in that field, and I think that was the path for me. And at that point, I went to university for my undergraduate studies, and then that sort of really sort of motivated me to come into doing social work.
So you were doing administrative work in the city, you volunteered, and you saw a number of things that must have had a deep impact on you. Could you describe that in more?
Well, I think the most important thing that when I was working in the city was noticing how social class,
Mm.
worked, and the impact it had on our society. Um, and of course, for me, coming from a working class background, I also knew that there were, and as a Black woman, I also knew that there were particular experiences that influenced, life circumstances. So at that time, my awareness was growing. I was also not, and still is, a feminist. So gender, race, and class were key things that I was being awakened to how it impacts lived experiences.
Okay. So just to go back, you're the administrative job in the city. You sort of went into that as a job, but then you realized that the world was slightly more interesting in a way, but more
And
challenging in this other
yeah,
path you took.
yeah, I wanted to do something that for me had meaning and was
Mhm.
contributing something.
And
So
you
that's
trained as a social worker.
yeah.
Um, and as you decided to do this new job, and that was when you began realizing the class differences, the gender, the race, and all that.
I think I realized that long before, but
Hmm.
I think when I went to university, it gave me some tools um, to name particular experiences, as social justice and social class and poverty and all those things. Going to university, I was very aware of those things before, but I didn't have the voice to articulate it, particularly in that environment. I was working in the city.
Oui.
But when I went to university, it just allowed me and gave me some critical tools that I was able to really kind of start thinking about societal factors and structural factors and systemic issues and the way it impacts lived experiences. And I think that was the grounding for me in social work.
Okay. And how has it changed from when you were training or when you began there to how it is now? Is progress being made?
And progress has been made in a lot of areas because in the late 80s, 90s, there was very little legislation around certain factors, in terms of domestic abuse. Child abuse at that time was in the 80s, the focus was mainly on neglect and physical abuse, and sexual abuse was only just being a this is a problem. So there was very little legislation, and being a social worker, in some ways, it gave a lot more autonomy because there was a lot more scope to interpret things, and there was a lot more scope to say um, to service users who may not have had access to the services. Now they wouldn't have access to the services because of eligibility criteria. There's a lot more scope to actually say, well, yeah, you didn't really tell me that you were 18. We'll just say you were 17, so you get
Okay.
access to the service. There's a lot more scope. There was a lot
Hmm.
more inventive ways to interpret legislation, whereas I think now it's much more restricted. So there's been progress, a lot of progress in a good way, but there's also constraints it's brought as well.
So those constraints, overregulation, I guess, is one of the words for it or something. But those constraints, is that having a negative impact on the people involved that are, you're trying to rescue from traumatic lives?
Well, some will argue now, yes, in some ways, because there's a lot of procedures, and particularly working with children and families. There are a lot of procedures, and there are sort of multi-agency ways of working and different systems in place, and sometimes the systems can be a barrier to doing really effective, meaningful work.
Mm.
Because you're constrained. Social workers are not they're not autonomous individual beings that make decisions about outcomes for children or family.
Because we had a previous guest on this series, I think said a similar thing to what you're saying, and she said that they weren't allowed to build a relationship with people, so they couldn't even send a birthday card or go to a birthday party and that sort of thing. Is this the type of restrictions you're talking about?
Yes, because when I worked as a social worker in the late 80s, 90s, I mean, I worked with young people. I worked with two young women for about 4 years. So I saw them through their adolescence and into young adulthood, and help them set up as young adults. Now, that's kind of when I say that to students now, that, oh, I worked with this young person for 4 or 5 years, and it was only after I'd been working with them for 2 years that they really started to open up to me about the problems that brought them into social services anyway. They are astounded because now, it's very brief, that intervention. So the relationship-based work I did in the early days was very different to what's happening now.
Because that is fascinating. It's one of the themes that has come through the interviews, conversations like this that I've had, is that there needs to be a relationship built up. There needs to be trust built up. There needs to be somebody who is a guide and a mentor who is, as you said, over a 4-year period, managed to take two young people through into adulthood. And what you're telling us is that the regulation, for want of a better word, or the rules prevent that happening now?
It's a barrier. It's a barrier to that, and obviously there are ways around it. In terms of I suppose how professionals bring their knowledge, their wisdom, and work with the systems around them is very critical to that, and the sort of managers and leadership they have around them to enable that to happen. But a significant difference now, another significant difference now, is that the level of need that practitioners are having to respond to now are far greater, and the complexities and the diversities around the experiences are very different to what I was talking about in my early career as a social worker. There was at that time in the team there might be two or three social workers who have two or three very complex cases.
Mm-hmm.
Now, on a social workers, if they're working with children and families, they might have a caseload of 20, 25, and they'll all be complex. So it doesn't give them time to build and develop that relationships in that
And
same way.
I want to move on just a second to this sort of definition or explanation of complex, but could we go back to the two young people that you sort of mentored through? How you were dealing with them then, and how would that be now? So you would have them plus your 20 other cases, but what other restrictions or opportunities would you have to make their life better or worse?
What now?
Now,
Oh,
yes.
doing that now. Well, for me, the critical thing is understanding the issues that impact lived experiences, because unless you can do that, you're not able to build a relationship to enable young people to trust you if you have no understanding. So, for example, at that time, one of those young women, was the reason she was in the system was that she was being sexually abused by her father. Um, at that time in the late 80s, it was very there was less knowledge about understanding the psychological process for young people. So there, the thinking might be that this young person is lying, and there is a resistance to actually believe what is happening, because it was seen as being rare then, sexual abuse. So because I was able to bring an understanding of what was going on for her, it enabled that relationship to be built. And of course, I had the time to do that.
Mm.
Whereas practitioners now, because they, have so many of those complex cases to deal with, and a whole range of complex needs, etc., that it requires very, very good supervision, support from line managers to help them navigate that kind of emotional impact, and how they
Yes, and also
professional boundaries and all the things that
yeah.
practitioners have to pay attention to.
Yeah, the time to build up that trust. The complexity of the cases. Just give me an example of a complex case. What makes it complicated? What are all the sort of competing factors?
Well, for example, particularly in some of the metropolitan London and the big cities, there is for disproportionately groups of young people, racially minoritized young people, come to the attention, and they might be at risk. They're vulnerable. They might be at risk of being groomed. They might be in home environments where they are experiencing neglect or physical abuse, or sometimes they have been sexual abuse. They may be living in situations where there is domestic abuse. They may be living in situations where parents have mental health challenges, difficulties, or parents may have substance misuse, alcohol misuse problems. Parents are in poverty. So there are many, many layers that makes those working with those young people complex. And also children may be, depending on their age and their understanding, and families may be resistant to social work involvement.
Mm-hmm.
So there are structural factors that have an impact, and there are organizational factors that have an impact, and there are psychological factors that have an impact on those experiences.
Is this? I mean, substance abuse, sexual abuse, parents with mental health problems, and raft of other stuff that one presumes. Is this because our society at that level is getting worse, and that's why there are more? Because
well, there are some issues that are different to 30, 40 years ago, because of the demographics and the demographics in the UK have changed dramatically. So some of the issues are different that, practitioners may have to respond to, honor-based violence, families who have insecure immigration status, who may not have any recourse to public funds, asylum-seeking children and families. So there are some things that are different and are much greater than they were 40, 20 years ago. But there are some issues that have always been there, but it's just been under the surface. So sexual abuse, domestic abuse, mental health problems, they've always been there. It's nothing new since the 80s or 90s. It's just that we're responding to it differently, and that societal recognition of those issues are different now.
So the issues are being exposed, as it were, we know about. Yeah. So, and which brings us to one of the issues that you mentioned right at the beginning, was there are more children coming into the system. And from what you said about the way these homes are, it would be, is it better to try to reconcile the home life, or to take them out and put them in residential homes, of which there are less than there were before?
Yeah. Well, for some of those children, they may come to the attention when they're babies, when they're under 5, before they go to school. And often those children are easier, I'd say easier in inverted commas, to place, to find alternative homes for them. But a significant number of children, disproportionate number of children, will come into the system when they're in their adolescent teenage years, when the one would argue the effects of trauma, the effects of neglect, the effects of all those factors that I talked about in relation to the adversities that they were experiencing, in adolescent, when they start to really play out in their behavior. And those are the children that it's difficult to find foster carers for. And often foster carers don't really want difficult, challenging children because, if you're fostering, you bring in a child into your family home, and obviously that has an impact. And also, a different factor now is that there is a lot more privatized care in terms of residential care, and those privatized care can be much more selective in who they take and don't take.
Yes, because they are not obliged, unlike the NHS, they don't have to take. It's like a hotel manager that has the, can refuse admission, as it were.
Yeah.
Yes.
So there are not some different factors at play.
Yes.
Adds to that.
So just to go back to the adolescents, the children, the younger children, they are going through the trauma. They might not realize it at the time, but they're going up from sort of 0 to 8 or 9, and that they're having this, but nobody knows about it. So they stay at the home. And then as they go into adolescence, they realize the trauma, and that plays out. And that's when they need to be taken away and put into foster care.
And for some of those children, it's often when, because sometimes professionals have been working with the families, but as I said before, because some of those issues in the families are so complex, often it arrives at a situation where maybe professionals don't know what can we do here to effect any real change, particularly when it's complex areas like neglect or mental health difficulties or substance misuse. And often it's when children are, at that adolescent stage when children are more influenced by the contextual factors around them. Because when they get into their early teens, and it becomes, parents' influence on children are lessened, when children are much more influenced by their peers and what's going on externally. And that's when, for a number of children, particularly racially minoritized children, may come to the attention of youth justice, and or they may have been excluded from school, etc.
Yes. I mean, could you just talk me through the process of recognizing that a child needs to be taken out of the family home and put into foster care or a residential home? How is that recognized? How's the family approach to do it? What are the reactions?
Well, in terms of the 1989 Children Act, there are various conditions around sexual abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse, neglect, and there are clear definitions set out to enable practitioners to recognize when a child may need a threshold. So it may be that, Section 17 of the Children Act, it gives social workers responsibilities to actually provide. So it might be to provide support for a family. We recognize that this family is struggling here and they need a bit of support to parent, and they need some advice and guidance in how to engage with their children and work with parent their children. And then Section 47 is where children are at risk of significant harm. So where the risks are that they're vulnerable to being sexually abused, or they're being physically abused, or they're being neglected. And that's the starting point for social workers to actually provide some intervention here. But of course, those significant harm, that's a very broad term, and that could be interpreted in many different ways, by different professionals. So that's where some of the problems are.
And given the lack of resources or the overworked social worker that we've talked about, are there many more young people and children slipping through the gaps, as it were, because they're not prioritized and the trauma goes on?
I don't know if there are more. I couldn't say that there are more than there were 20 or 30 years ago slipping through the gaps. But what we do know is that children do fall through the gaps. And we see that in the number of child death reviews that are done. Those reports are on the NSPCC's platform and could be accessed. And I can't remember off the top of my head now the numbers for the 24-25 period. But you can have a look at that platform and get a sense of how many child death reviews that are being done across England here I'm talking about.
And then when you say, because of course 20 or 30 years ago it wasn't known that there were problems because they were kept under wraps when they were children, but now they're recognized, but perhaps the resources are not there to deal with it.
Well, no, it wasn't that 20 years ago they weren't recognized. I suppose the responses were very different. So take, for example, something like county lines,
right,
which is where that was under the radar 20 years ago. I don't know if I can't say that didn't happen 20 years ago, but it was under the radar. But now it's above the radar, and it's responded to in relation to how children who go missing. Now the case I told you about, that I started to work with when I was a social worker, the young woman who came to our attention because of sexual abuse at home. Now she was going missing from him. She was running away, which is, and she came to our attention and we responded. And with county lines now, that's where children go missing. They're missing from school. They're missing from home. But that's happening on larger numbers now, and it's recognized as a real problem. So I wouldn't say that it wasn't recognized.
Yes,
probably different responses.
Just for our wider audience, explain in a nutshell county lines.
Oh, sorry. County lines is where a young person might be being exploited, being criminally exploited or sexually exploited, where they're groomed and they are used to move drugs to different parts of the country. So they might be living in London, they might be living in South London, and they might be being used to take drugs to Brighton or somewhere out of London. And those children might be missing for weeks, sometimes days or weeks. Those children might be missing. And it's how the local authorities now work together to actually respond to that issue.
And the county lines bit is the British county system. So it's the gangs controlling the different counties.
Yeah.
What impact does it have on a child as they go through adulthood if they've kept the trauma that they're experiencing under the radar for so long? And as you vividly said, it sort of comes out in adolescence. What long-term impact does that have? And if it was recognized earlier, how much better off would they be?
Well, the long-term impact is obviously mental health challenges and difficulties. And we know from the research that children who experience trauma, whatever their class background or racial background, children who experience childhood trauma and particularly adversities in childhood are at higher risk of developing mental health problems as they get into their late teens, early 20s, and which is often the onset of mental health, developing mental health problems, that early 20s, late teens. And as I said, the regardless of class background or racial background or gender background, those children young people are at higher risk of
Mhm.
developing mental health problems or
Yes.
substance misuse problems
Yes.
or alcohol misuse problems.
You've told us very concisely, and that we've got more children coming in. There are less foster carers because of the troubled children, and you also mentioned less residential homes. Are they actually being closed down because and the private sector doesn't want to move in and take up that vacuum or that slack?
Well, the private sector had moved in and were and there has been concern about the high costs to local authorities for um, having children placed in those private services, and that's been addressed now. And more recently, different local authorities are collaborating to actually think about how they could build and come back to residential care, that residential establishment that could be shared between 3 or 4 local authorities in a particular region.
Right, and this is so. Is it money? I mean, is it government money that's stopping this, or is it the system? Or I mean, do you envisage 10 years from now there would be enough residential places to put troubled children in?
Well, it's a combination of things because I think the thinking, which is where when different local authorities um, closed many of their residential care, the thinking was influenced by this notion that children were better served in families and
Mm.
that residential care was not the best place for all children or some children.
You don't agree with that?
Um, I think for some children and for some children, the family environment, depending on what's going on for children, putting them in another family environment is not going to work. Uh,
Mm.
it doesn't work for all children, depending on what those children experiences were in their biological families.
So the child loses trust in the family system and environment and prefers an institution.
For some children, yes, that may be an issue.
Yeah.
And that is quite a difficult one to grapple with because at a societal level, it still is very much embedded this idea that the family is the best, and particular forms of family are the best place for bringing up children.
Mm.
And no doubt some social workers would have those views and beliefs and values as well. So there are many factors there, I think, that come into play.
Yes, I mean, I came to your point of view, not here, but as a BBC correspondent when I was doing child trafficking in particular story I did in Uganda. And it was quite clear that the children were terrified when they were with their wider family because they were going to be trafficked into something.
Yeah.
And they wouldn't speak. But then when we went to a charity that took them in, they were having fun. They were playing football. They were trusting. They were
Yeah,
making friends. You couldn't stop them from speaking,
yeah,
and
yeah,
and that was my turning point because it was so vivid there. And you were talking about the abuse within the constant abuse within the families there. But do we have that sort of setup here in Britain that could handle that?
Well, I think that's the sort of problem that policymakers and practitioners and the government are struggling with. What is the best way? Um,
Mm.
what is the best way to care for children, particularly if children are not able to remain within their family? The issue of adoption is also very complex because not as many babies and very young children are available for adoption, and and the children that need homes are often the disproportionate group that are not able to find matched adopters. So I think there are many layers that policymakers and managers and leaders in social care and social work are sort of grappling with.
Well, I want you to grapple with 6 of them now that I've just sort of got from our conversation. The first thing that you talked about when you realized that you were talking about class, ethnicity and gender. Let's go through each of those and how it was then, how it is now, how much of a problem it is. The British class system, is that getting better or worse?
I think we don't talk about class a lot, and in terms of the protective characteristics, in terms of equalities and diversity, class isn't listed there, and I think that's quite telling, because structurally in our society, social class is a huge marker for life circumstances, and disproportionately it's those people who are on the margins, who are poor, low income, that are needing the services. And it also, I think, I did a piece of research about 5-6 years ago looking at child abuse and neglect in affluent families. And it sort of just really highlight that it's just a bigger problem there. The differences, social class, enable those families to remain under the radar because they have the social capital, the cultural capital, to actually keep social services away from their door.
But so it was still going on.
Yeah, so we still, I argue that it's still embedded in our ideas and in social work that poverty is the cause of most of the family who come to the attention of social services, is the root cause of the problems. Poverty is a big factor, but neglect, for example, is often used interchangeably with poverty. Well, they're being neglected because they're in poverty. But the research that I did into affluent family was very much about neglect, but it was about emotional neglect, which also has a significant problems on children's emotional psychological development.
Career chasing middle class high achievers neglecting their children in order to, and then the children feel.
The children, but the children are being cared for physically, but not because they have nannies and drivers. There's people. The caring is out. The parenting is outsourced. Somebody else is doing all that.
And the other thing that you were talking about is ethnicity or diversity. Give us a thought on that.
So in terms of I mentioned earlier on that the demographics in the UK has changed significantly over the past 30 years or so, and the issues that are brought with that are, there are some issues that are very, in terms of under the broad umbrella of child abuse and neglect, are very different in terms of, we've got female genital mutilation, honor-based violence, forced marriage, a whole range of different factors that bring a different set of issues in terms of how we understand and interpret what is abuse and what is neglect, what is harm. And of course,
sorry, the whole grooming gang issue was that they were trying to, that was covered up in order to protect a particular cultural set.
Well, that's one of the arguments that's put forward, and there are more to it than that, because I presume you're talking about the grooming gangs in the north of England.
Yeah, so that's right. Yes,
predominantly, I think, South Asian men of Pakistani origin. But I think what's the impression that the media gave was those perpetrators were predominantly Asian men, and the victims were predominantly white girls. But the victims were also young Asian women as well, but they were kind of excluded out of in terms of who are the victims here, which is a factor that happens around race and ethnicity in social welfare, in terms of who is thought to be vulnerable and who needs protection and who can, are street smart and therefore they don't need the same protection. So there's a lot of factors there, which I think race and racism
Yes.
is important, but disproportionately some of those young people in who are being groomed in and being criminally exploited are and who come into the system because of poverty or other adversities are disproportionately racially minoritized children.
Yes. And then the final thing, well, not final, but the other one you mentioned was gender.
Well, gender is social work is predominantly at the front line ground level. It's predominantly women working with predominantly women as mothers and as carers. And often fathers are not involved or brought in the same way. Fathers are not worked with in relation to doing work with families.
Yes.
And in domestic abuse situation, etc., often it's the fathers who are perpetrating that. So there are factors there in terms of how gender is addressed. And also, I argue in several papers that I've written that often there's a lot of mother blaming that still goes on in social work, because all the attention focuses on mothers to keep those children well and safe, etc., when often they are they're in domestic abuse situation.
Just before we finish, I just wonder, you've given us a fantastic picture. Actually, it's not fantastic; it's quite grim. But on the challenges that I put forward to you at the end, which I've got less residential homes, more children, less foster carers, and that whole environment that you have so vividly given us. If you had the seat at the top table, what would you do now to make this system better?
Yeah. Well, if I had the seat at the top table, that being in that role, I know would be very much influenced by the perspective and the frameworks that I bring to make sense of social problems, and that would be very much influenced by understanding how the structural and systemic factors is a major contribution. But also, I would be wanting as a leader, I would be wanting to be engaging with the managers, the policymakers, the frontline workers, to have those bold conversations to really name some of the problems around gender, around race, around social class. To think about how do we understand our policies and our systems. How can we ensure that our policies or systems don't exacerbate those problems, but are enabling us to kind of meaningfully engage and
in practical
change.
In practical terms, I mean, what you just described there is sort of mood changing mindsets, really, and that's. But in practical terms, should the doors open for the private sector to come in and build these residential homes, or should the government do it, or?
In terms of my own values and beliefs, I don't agree that profit-making organizations should be involved in social welfare responses to children. Because those private organizations, at the end of the day, they are there to make a profit. We can't be making profits out of children's misery.
Okay, even if it's profit to keep the company, even if they plough the profits back into building another
They're not.
residential
No,
home.
they're not. They're not going to be ploughing it back for the good of the children.
So
The investors have to get their
yeah,
their,
the investors get that, and so the reason I'm sort of trying to nail this down is if the government isn't going to put the money forward to do this in sort of to do the bricks and mortar, they'll pay the funding packages.
yeah.
Would it not be better to, even if the investors get their dividends and
No, the investors have
absolutely not. Yeah.
no place in making profit from children's
Right.
horror and misery.
Yeah. Okay. All right then. That is great. We are out of time.
Yeah.
But Time Swing Charities Attack. But thank you, Claudia, for sharing it. Vivid is one of the most vivid explanations and pictures I've had of the society that we're in. That had been actually great. But before I let you go, could you give us a takeaway thought? One thing that we can go away, hopefully with a spring in our step a bit.
The question I always put to, after I've done, my lectures with students and given them a picture of the misery that's out there that they'll be faced, the question I always pose to them is, how do we foster hopefulness, and how do we try and understand how young people, if you're working with children and families in very hopeless situation, how do you enable them to be hopeful? Because if you haven't got hope, then there's not much you can be doing.
I love that. How can we enable a child and a young person to be hopeful?
Yeah.
I think hope is the key thing. That is fantastic. For any comments, questions, challenges to Claudia Bernard, please get in touch with professional talk at carevisions.co.uk or contact Claudia directly through Goldsmiths College at c.bernard@gold.ac.uk. That's right, is it, Claudia? I think
That's great.
That's right to me. Thank you very much. We hope to talk to you again. We'll see how things progress. Thanks so much for your time. Thanks so much for bringing us up to speed and taking us inside that world. And until the next professional talk, everyone, stay safe and goodbye. To hear more episodes, discover upcoming discussions, or access free tools and resources, scroll down to the episode description for all the links. And from me, Humphrey Hawksley, and all at Care Visions, stay safe and goodbye.